Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Pursuant to Order adopted on October 28, 2022.
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance to make a statement. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 32-2, I have the honour to table, in both official languages, the Fall Economic Statement 2022. Pursuant to Standing Order 83-1, I would also like to table, in both official languages, a notice of a Ways and Means motion to implement certain provisions of the Fall Economic Statement tabled in Parliament on November 3rd, 2022, and certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on April 7th, 2022. Pursuant to Standing Order 83-2, I would ask that an order of the day be designated for the consideration of this motion. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. For the past several months, I have been traveling across Canada to more than 24 cities and towns to meet with Canadian workers and Canadian businesses. I visited an auto parts manufacturer in Etobicoke, a potash mine outside Saskatoon, and the women and men in Sherbrooke who make the boots our armed forces wear around the world.
I visited the port of St. John in New Brunswick and a family farm in Olds, Alberta, and in Dartmouth and in Brampton and in Calgary. I spent time with some of the truckers who keep our economy humming. The Canadians I spoke to were all so proud of our country. They were proud of the hard work they do every day to feed Canada and the world, to build our cars, to send our goods to global markets, to raise their children. But they were also anxious about whether our future will be as prosperous as our past, and anxious about paying the bills today. And that's where I want to start, with the high cost of living so many of us, so many Canadians are concerned about. I know that it has felt like just one thing after another since COVID first reached our shores. We turned the economy off, and then we turned it back on again. Vladimir Putin illegally invaded Ukraine. And now we're dealing with inflation. These are related, of course. Global inflation isn't created by the decisions of any one government alone, but by the combined aftershocks of 2.5 years of historic turmoil.
Inflation was 6.9% in September, after following for the third month in a row. That is lower than in the US, the UK, and the Eurozone. But for Canadians feeling the pinch at the checkout counter or when they fill their tanks with gas, it is still too high. This is a challenging time for so many of us, for our friends, for our families, for our neighbors.
It's important, as both the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance, that I'm honest with Canadians about the challenges that still lie ahead. Interest rates are rising as the Bank of Canada steps in to tackle inflation. And that means our economy is slowing down. It means there are people whose mortgage payments are rising. It means business is no longer booming in the same way it has been since we left our homes after the COVID lockdowns and went back out into the world. That's the case in Canada. That's the case in the United States. And that is the case in economies big and small around the world. Canada cannot avoid the global slowdown any more than we could have avoided COVID once it had begun infecting the world. But we will be ready. Indeed, we are ready. That's because for the past 7 years, our government has been reinforcing Canada's social safety net. We have improved many important programs and added some new ones, too.
These investments in Canadians are like a well-built house with a solid roof, needed in all seasons and in all weather, but most essential when the temperature drops. And that is why, as fall turns to winter, we will continue to stand up to those who would cut the EI and the pensions Canadians have been contributing to for their entire working lives and need today more than ever. It's why we created the Canada Child Benefit and why we are making childcare more affordable. It's why we enhanced the benefits that those who served with our flag on their shoulder depend on. It's why we doubled the Canada Student Grant to make it a little easier for all young people to go to college or university or to pursue an apprenticeship. It's why we enhanced the Canada Workers' Benefit and why we increased both old age security and the guaranteed income supplement.
That is why it is so important that the Canada Pension Plan and our most important benefits are all indexed to inflation. And in today's fall economic statement, that is why we're delivering on a plan that millions of Canadians voted for just over a year ago, and why we're delivering new measures to enhance the social safety net that is there to support all Canadians. We're working to deliver lower credit card fees so that small businesses don't need to choose. So that small businesses don't need to choose between cutting into their already narrow margins and passing fees onto their customers. We're taxing share buybacks to make sure that large corporations pay their fair share and to encourage them to reinvest their profits in Canadian workers and in Canada. We're delivering a multi-generational home renovation tax credit, which will help families across Canada afford to have a grandparent or a family member with a disability move back in if they want to. we're tackling housing speculation and making sure that homes are for Canadians to live in, not a frequently flipped investment asset. We're delivering on our commitment to make home ownership more affordable for young people and new Canadians with a new tax-free first home savings account that will make it so much easier to save for a down payment. And we're delivering with a doubling of the first-time home buyer's tax credit to help cover the closing costs that come with buying that first home of your own. We are permanently eliminating interest on the federal portion of Canada student loans and Canada Accelerated. We're working to make sure that families don't need to choose between taking their child to the dentist and putting food on the table. We're creating a new quarterly Canada Workers Benefit to deliver advance payments and put more money sooner into the pockets of our lowest paid and often most essential workers. This means the Canada Workers Benefit will now support 4.2 million Canadians. We're providing hundreds of dollars in new targeted support to low-income renters. For the Canadians who need it the most, we are doubling the GST credit for the next 6 months. And I have some very good news about that. For the 11 million Canadian households who need help the most, those GST checks will start arriving in your bank account or in your mailbox tomorrow. Nous doublons le crédit.
And for the Canadians who need it the most, we are doubling the GST credit for the next 6 months. And I have some very good news. For the 11 million Canadians who need help the most, those GST checks will start arriving in your bank accounts and in your mailbox starting tomorrow.
Nous offrons.
We are providing targeted inflation relief because that is the right thing to do. And as the Bank of Canada fights inflation, we will not make its job harder. We are compassionate and we are also responsible.
Canada has the lowest deficit and Canada has the lowest deficit and the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7. In our April budget, with inflation in Canada and around the world elevated and still rising, we knew we had to chart a fiscally responsible course, and we did. In April, we committed to bringing the deficit down to just 2% of GDP this year. Today, we forecast it will be just 1.3% of our $2.8 trillion economy. We can bring the deficit down today because our pandemic spending worked. Thanks to the historic support we provided, and thanks to the incredible resilience of Canadians, Canada is entering this time of a slowing global economy from a position of fundamental economic strength. There are 400,000 more Canadians working today than before the pandemic. Our economy is now 103% the size it was before COVID hit. So far this year, Canada's economic growth has been the strongest in the G7, stronger than the United States, stronger than the United Kingdom, stronger than Germany, stronger than France, stronger than Italy or Japan. Thanks to that enviable economic performance, we're able to provide targeted support to the most vulnerable while still shrinking our deficit. In the months to come, we will be able to invest in the Canadian economy and to be there for the Canadians who need it the most, because we were responsible in April and because we are keeping our powder dry today. Canadians are tough, and the Canadian economy is resilient. And that's why we can all be confident we will get through this, just as we have gotten through so much over the past 2.5 years. In fact, there is no country in the world better placed than Canada to get through. There is no country better placed than Canada to get through the coming global slowdown.
And when we do, with our fundamental economic strengths preserved and the pandemic recession behind us, there is no country in the world better placed than Canada to thrive in a post-COVID global economy. We grow food to feed the world, and we mine the potash that farmers here and elsewhere need to grow their own. We have the critical minerals and metals that are essential for everything, from cell phones to batteries to appliances to electric cars. We have the natural resources to power the global net zero transition and to support our allies with their energy security as that transition continues to pick up speed. And critically, Canada is the democracy that has all of these resources in abundance.
The global economy is at a turning point. We're entering an era of friendshoring, a time when our democratic partners and their most important companies are seeking to shift their dependence from dictatorships to democracies. That's why the Prime Minister and Chancellor Scholz signed an agreement in Newfoundland for Germany to buy Canadian hydrogen. That's why the United States has moved from a Buy America to a Buy North America policy on critical minerals and electric vehicles. C'est pourquoi.
That is why our Minister of Industry has been signing agreements with global car manufacturers and battery makers. A new one almost every day, it seems to me.
That is why our Minister of Natural Resources is pitching Canada's critical minerals to the world and working hard with provinces and territories to get them out of the ground and to global markets. Because the world knows Canada can build the electric vehicles of today and tomorrow. Canadians can mine and process the critical minerals that those vehicles, our phones, and our computers are all made of. And Canadian energy workers, the very best in the world, can make Canada the leading provider of energy as the global economy moves to net zero. Our allies are counting on us, and our government believes that this ongoing shift is the most significant opportunity for Canadian workers and Canadian businesses in a generation. Les investissements.
Seizing this opportunity is what our April budget invested in. And it is what this fall economic statement invests in too. With major investment tax credits for clean technology and clean hydrogen, we will make it more attractive for businesses to invest in Canada to produce the energy that will power a net zero global economy.
We are launching a new Canada Growth Fund that will help attract the billions of dollars in new private capital required to fight climate change and to create good jobs in Canada at the same time. From critical minerals to ports to energy, we will continue to make it easier for businesses to invest in major projects in Canada. Projects with meaningful Indigenous participation, projects that meet the highest environmental standards, projects that will create good jobs, and projects that will allow Canadian workers to drive our economy forward. We will continue to invest in tackling the productivity challenge that is Canada's economic Achilles heel. We will continue to invest in making sure that Canadians have the skills they need to get good-paying jobs, and we will continue to bring to Canada more of the skilled workers that our growing economy requires. But we know that these investments represent only a down payment on the work that lies ahead. And so, in the months to come, we will continue to work hard to ensure that Canada is the best place in the world for businesses to invest and create good-paying jobs from coast to coast to coast. Yep. Now, these investments, the ones we're making today and the ones we will continue to make, will be crucial to the future of the Canadian economy. They will help make Canada a leader in the industries of tomorrow. They will help to build an economy that is more sustainable and more prosperous for generations to come. But what matters most is what these investments mean for Canadians. If you're an energy worker in Alberta, investments in clean energy mean there will continue to be good-paying jobs for you and your children. If you're a young couple in Vancouver, more workers in the building trades means more affordable homes for your new family. And if you're an auto worker in Windsor, Canadian leadership on electric vehicles means you will build the next generation of the cars that have powered our economy for more than a century.
Bravo.
Canadian workers know how important our social safety net is, and that is why our government will never deplete the contributions that keep Canada's employment insurance and pensions strong.
And Canadian workers know how important training is to equip them for valuable, good-paying jobs. So we are investing in that as well. But Canadian workers also know that the single most important thing, the difference between managing to pay your mortgage and fearing you could lose your home, the difference between paying the bills at the end of the month and falling behind, is a well-paid, stable job. Doing work that you are proud of with people who respect you and your skills. That's why our overriding economic objective during COVID was to preserve Canadians' jobs. And that's why today, what Canadian workers need is a government with a real, robust industrial policy. A government committed to investing in the net zero transition, to bringing in new private investment, and to help create good-paying jobs from coast to coast to coast. And that is exactly what we've been doing. And that is what we are continuing to do today.
Now, Mr. Speaker, in 1903, Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier stood in this House, and he said, "This is not a time for deliberation. This is a time for action. We cannot wait because time does not wait. We cannot wait because in these days of wonderful development, time lost is doubly lost. We cannot wait because at this moment there is a transformation going on in the conditions of our national life, which it would be folly to ignore and a crime to overlook." He was speaking then about the Transcontinental Railway, one that connected Canada and the Canadian economy from east to west, and which helped usher in a new era of prosperity for the people of our growing country. That project, like Laurier himself, was imperfect. The prosperity and opportunity it brought were not shared equally with Indigenous peoples, with women, with new Canadians. But his message then is one that we should heed today, that we must heed today. At the turn of the last century, Laurier and a generation of Canadian statesmen understood that Canada was at a turning point and that we could seize it or risk being swept aside by the manifest destiny of more ambitious leaders. Today, we are likewise at a pivotal moment. The global green transition calls for an industrial transformation comparable in scale only to the Industrial Revolution itself. And Canada is blessed with the talented people, the natural resources, and the manufacturing base needed to drive that transformation. At the same time, Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine has upended geopolitics, reinforcing for our allies the value of turning to each other, to us, for the critical elements of their supply chains and for their energy security. Together, these two great shifts represent a generational opportunity to build a thriving and sustainable Canadian economy. We can lead the world in a way that far exceeds our footprint as a country of just 39 million people. Nous pouvons mener la lutte contre les...
We can lead the fight against climate change, and we can do it in a way that creates good jobs and new businesses for Canadians from coast to coast to coast. We can build affordable homes and deliver affordable childcare, helping our economy grow and making life more affordable for middle-class families. And we can ensure that everyone in this country can enjoy the prosperity we are investing in together. That is the future that we can create for ourselves and for our children. But we cannot wait, because time truly does not wait. We cannot wait because in these days of wonderful development, time lost is doubly lost. I know that times feel tough right now, and they are. But we have a well-built house with a solid roof, and we have survived far colder winters before. And just as fall turns to winter, so too does winter turn to spring.
Ahead, and we will reach them together by building a country where everyone can earn a good living for a hard day's work, by building an economy that works for everyone, by investing in the Canada we are all so proud of today, so that we can be even prouder of our amazing country tomorrow. Because of all the countries in the world, the 21st century will surely belong to Canada.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
The Prime Minister's policies have caused 4-year highs in inflation, leading to massive interest rate hikes on Canadians, which will cost Canadian families $3,000 a year. Today, the Prime Minister had a chance to give Canadians some relief by cancelling the carbon tax on home heating, but they refused. They refused, despite the fact home heating bills will increase by 50 to 100% this winter. They refused, despite billions in new tax revenue on the growling stomachs of Canadians. Will the Prime Minister stop punishing Canadians and cancel their plans to triple the carbon tax on home heating?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we absolutely understand that times are tough for so many Canadians today. And that's why I was so glad to share some great news. And that is that the GST credit will start arriving in the bank accounts and in the mailboxes of 11 million Canadian households tomorrow. That is much needed support. It is going to provide such valuable inflation relief to the Canadians who need it the most. But that's not all, Mr. Speaker. We are moving forward with $500 to support the Canadians who are struggling to pay their rent. Again, much needed support for the people who need it the most. And that's not all, Mr. Speaker. We are moving forward to ensure that never again in Canada will a mother have to choose between buying groceries and taking her kid to the dentist. That is not right in Canada, and we are going to change that, Mr. Speaker. There's a lot more we're going to do, and I'll talk about it in a minute.
Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Joliette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for her speech. She spouted a lot of rhetoric, but when we look at the concrete measures that are in the economic statement, when we try to see what is new relatively to the spring budget, well, we can see that there isn't much. She has just given 2 examples, which are measures that were already passed before today's presentation of the statement. What I like in her speech is that she recognizes that we're in a financial crisis and that there's a recession coming. But what I'm upset about is that there are no new tangible measures to tell Canadians and Quebecers what the government is going to do to support them. For example, the Bloc Québécois said, well, if we're heading into a recession, then we know that the EI system doesn't work. It's broken, and it's now or never. It's time to repair it before we hit a recession. But there's nothing announced to that end in the statement. And what about the increase in prices? What are seniors going to do, especially those aged 65 to 75 who did not receive an addition to their benefits? There are no new measures for seniors, and they can't make ends meet anymore. There are no tax measures either to incentivize workers if they want to, for example, seniors who want to work a few days a week. And finally, when it comes to healthcare, we know that all provincial and Quebec health systems, they're all broken. And in a few days, the health ministers are going to be meeting across the country with the federal health minister. But what are they going to discuss if there are no new measures? We were hoping that we would get the $28 billion and a firm commitment to have an increase of 6% per year. And they're going to meet in 4 days. But what are they going to discuss? Because there's nothing new in this statement. So we know that there are problems coming. We know we're in the midst of problems. But there are no new measures in this statement. So how is it going to work? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I would like to begin by underscoring that this is a fall economic statement. It's not a budget. It's a continuation of the work that we began in April and that we're going to continue to do. And I have a great deal of respect for the member across the way, but I would like to point out that we have already announced and implemented and delivered support measures that will make a huge difference in the lives of Canadians. For example, the GST credit. That is real support. What about rental relief? That's a real measure. What about the new dental care plan? That is real support as well. And I will be announcing new measures, major new measures, in the coming weeks and months. We understand that times are particularly tough right now. And for that very reason, our government will be there for Canadians with assistance for our students and for our most essential workers as well, because many of them are very poorly remunerated. So I think that's a very important measure. I think it's a targeted measure, and it's going to help people who need it the most. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There are certainly some items that the Finance Minister has mentioned that are very familiar to us New Democrats, because they're the things that we have been pressuring this government into doing, whether that's dental care, whether it's the Canada Housing Benefit, frankly, whether it's child care, or many other things that we could go on about, including the GST rebate that's coming to Canadians tomorrow. But today was an opportunity to go above and beyond those things, to address the real challenges that people are facing as we come into a fall and they're worried about home heating and the cost of groceries. And as we learn that Loblaws is making $1 million a day more in profit above their latest banner year. So what we thought we might have seen, in addition to things that the NEP has required of the government to move on, were things like more serious consequences for price fixing in the grocery industry. We wanted to see a windfall profit tax so that these companies that are making extraordinary profits in the pandemic context are required to pay more in order for there to be assistance for Canadians. We want to see the GST on home heating removed, a measure that would apply across the country and not just in provinces that are subject to the federal carbon tax. We want to see that the government is now starting to indicate there may be a recession coming, except that they just reverted to the pre-pandemic broken EI system just as people are starting to worry about looking for work. Where is the promised EI modernization reform that the government has been talking about forever? And I also want to say I was very disappointed to note that the only reference to health care in this document is about dental care. That's a good thing. We should be moving forward on that. But at a time when most Canadians don't trust that if they go to the emergency room, they're going to be seen and helped, we need way more investment in healthcare, working collaboratively, of course, with the provinces. But we need to see that the federal government is willing to come to the table with those dollars. So on all these many things that this was an opportunity to take action on, why haven't we seen any action on those important issues?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this is the first time that I've answered a question from the member for Transcona since the death of his father, who served honorably here, and I do want to start by paying tribute to him. He was a very important person for Canadians, for his constituents, and for progressive causes in Canada. Now, Mr. Speaker, I do believe that this is a fall economic statement that will make a difference in the lives of Canadians. It will make a difference in the lives of the Canadians who need help the most. And Mr. Speaker, one of the themes in this fall economic statement is support for hard-working Canadians. And you see that in the Canada Workers' Benefit. We are moving this to an advance payment because people who work really, really hard for really low pay, they can't wait until the fiscal year is over to get that top up. They need it while they're working. And I think they deserve it, Mr. Speaker. We should be rewarding them for doing those hard jobs and encouraging them to do it. So this is an important measure. I am really, really glad that it is here. And I want to say how much I thank all of those hardworking people who get the Canada Workers' Benefit and how much I respect them. Mr. Speaker, there's another element in this fall economic statement which is directly about supporting hardworking Canadians and making sure there are great jobs for them. And that is that in our green tax credits, in the hydrogen credit, in the clean tech tax credit, we have included provisions for high-wage, good jobs and apprenticeships. That's the first time we've done that, Mr. Speaker. It will make a big difference.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When we learned that the Costly Coalition would be introducing this economic update today, we had two demands. No new taxes on workers and seniors, and no new spending unless matched by equal savings. Today, this inflationary scheme triples the tax on home heat, gas, and groceries, and adds $20 billion of inflationary spending that will drive up the cost of living. And so, Conservatives will stand for the common people, their paychecks, their homes, their savings, and we will vote against this inflationary scheme. Quand les conservateurs ont appris que la coalition...
When we Conservatives learned that the Costly Coalition was going to table this fall economic statement, we had two demands. First, no new taxes. Second, no new spending, unless that spending is paid through savings made elsewhere. But today, we're learning that this inflationary scheme is hiking up the cost of home heat, gas, and groceries. Conservatives defend Canadians, regular Canadians. We stand up for their savings, their paychecks, their quality of life, and we stand against this inflationary scheme.
How did we get here? Well, the cost of government is driving up the cost of living. $500 billion of inflationary deficits have bid up the cost of the goods we buy and the interest that we pay. Inflationary taxes have increased the cost of businesses, farmers, and workers to produce those very same goods. Now, Liberals will pretend that they had no choice but to double the debt. This Prime Minister will claim that it's not his fault that he added more debt than all previous Prime Ministers combined. Let's start with the fact that he added $100 billion of debt before the very first COVID case was ever discovered here in Canada. He can't blame COVID for that. In fact, he blew through his promise that the deficit would never exceed $10 billion. Well, it was already $100 billion in total before the first case of COVID. Then when COVID came, 40% of all the new spending measures had nothing to do with COVID, according to the Prime Minister's own named parliamentary budget officer. $200 billion of spending unrelated to COVID. And even amongst the COVID spending was an all-you-can-eat buffet of waste and mismanagement. They sent CERB checks to prisoners. They sent them to public servants who were simultaneously drawing public salaries. They gave wage subsidies to wealthy corporations that were rich enough to pay out dividends and bonuses to their executives, even after I warned that they should ban that hideous practice. They tried to give $500 million to the We Charity, an organization that had given $500,000 to the Prime Minister's own family. They spent $54 million on an app we didn't need, that didn't work, and that could have been designed in a weekend for $250,000. The previous Conservative government had successfully delivered apps that were actually necessary and useful of a similar complexity for $200,000 or $300,000, but somehow this one went to $54 million. Many of the recipients admit they didn't do any work. They just hired other people to do work. So they gave the money to people who didn't do anything other than delegate the work to someone else. Don't we have public servants getting paid within the government to deliver those sorts of contracting? And now the government won't even tell us all of the identity of the recipients of that money. Yeah. So don't tell me they had to double the size of the national debt. Don't tell me that every dollar of inflationary spending was necessary. They were irresponsible and they were unnecessarily profligate with the dollars of Canadians, and now people are paying the price.
That's right.
Yeah. Now the Prime Minister will say, well, Russia caused the inflation in Canada. Yeah. Well, of course, we do less than 0.3% of our trade with Russia and Ukraine combined, beyond which the stuff they make is the stuff that we have here already. They have energy and food. We have energy and food. If only the Prime Minister would get out of the way of our farmers and energy workers and let them produce. Beyond which, under the previous Conservative government, there were wars. There was massive war in Afghanistan, another one in Iraq, and Syria. And we never had inflation anywhere over 4%. In fact, we were able to successfully contribute to defeating terrorists and tyrants in those conflicts while keeping the inflation level low here in Canada. Right. We were able to get our spending under control and our budget back into balance. This government, by contrast, has spending today 30% higher than in the pre-COVID year 2019. Why? They said all the deficits were the result of COVID. COVID now is behind us and spending is still 30% higher, because we know that it is not COVID that has caused the cost to rise. It is a costly coalition and an irresponsible Prime Minister who have put these burdens on Canadian shoulders.
We all know that government spending today is 30% higher than it was the year before COVID. Why? Well, because COVID is not to blame for all this rising spending, exorbitant spending. What is to blame is a Prime Minister who has no control over Canadians' money. The more the Prime Minister spends, the more Canadians pay, and that's why we have just inflation, the highest inflation in 40 years.
Also loves to blame all the cost of living rises on other people. Well, why is it then that house prices in this country are the second most inflated anywhere on planet Earth?
It's true.
Thank you. Why is it that land costs have gone through the roof? Land is not imported from Ukraine or Russia. Right. Land is right beneath our feet. Yeah. And we have the second biggest supply of it anywhere on Earth. Yeah. And yet, Vancouver is the third most overpriced housing market on planet Earth, and Toronto the 10th. Can you imagine that? Two of our biggest cities have more inflated housing prices than New York City, than London, England, than countless other big metropolises that have more people, more money, and less land. In fact, Vancouver's house prices are more inflated than Singapore. Singapore is an island. Wow. They're out of land. Canada has more land where there's no one than we have land where there's anyone. So why is it that we cannot find a place to house everyone? Well, the first reason is that local government gatekeepers prevent housing construction by piling on massive delays that drive up the cost and drive down the supply of housing. This Prime Minister has had 7 years to stand up to the municipal and provincial gatekeepers that stand in the way of housing construction. But he would never do that because he does not want to confront the Liberal, NDP, radical left at city halls across the country that have made this problem worse. And so what he's done instead is continued to shovel money into their local bureaucracies to reward them for blocking the poor, for blocking the immigrants, for blocking our working class kids from ever owning a home. When I'm Prime Minister, we will impose conditions that if cities want more federal infrastructure money, they'll have to remove the gatekeepers. We will connect their infrastructure dollars to the number of houses that actually get built so that young people can find a place to live. And we will sell off 15% of the 37,000 federal buildings so that they can be converted into housing and our young people can have affordable homes. The second reason that we have such expensive housing and such expensive everything is because the Prime Minister engaged in a massive orgy of money printing over the last 2 years. Now, he said that money printing wouldn't cause inflation, right? Even though that's exactly what it has done every single time it has been tried over the last roughly 3,000 years, right? So here's how it worked. The Prime Minister wanted to be able to claim that he was borrowing all this money on the cheap. He loved to stand in the House and say that his debt wasn't costing any money because interest rates were so low. Well, the only reason he could borrow for next to nothing is because his central bank was creating the cash out of thin air. If it had been real lenders, they would have demanded a real rate of return on their loans. So what happened is they created something called quantitative easing. Whenever they invent new, incomprehensible terminology, Mr. Speaker, you can be sure that there's something sinister behind it. And here's how it works. Very simple. The government sells bonds to lenders. Bank of Canada buys back those bonds at a higher price. The lenders love it. That's why the banks thoroughly endorse this strategy. Because they made the money on the difference. Simple arbitrage. The government sells them something on a Monday and buys it back for them at a higher price on a Wednesday. Who wouldn't go for that deal? Well, unfortunately, only about 100 financial institutions are eligible to participate in it. The rest of the ordinary, hardworking Canadians who pay for it are not. But the banks and the insurance companies and other financial institutions profited off of this transaction. Now, the Bank of Canada pays for those bonds by depositing money in the accounts of those large financial institutions held on reserve at the Bank of Canada. And so those reserves skyrocketed over the last 2 years, and as the bank bought up to $400 billion of new debt. And what happened? That exploded the money supply, and more dollars chasing fewer goods reach higher prices. Much of the money then funneled into the financial system and was lent out in mortgages to wealthy investors who saw a massive expansion in the number of real estate holdings they could accumulate. Thus, housing prices went up 50% in 2 years, creating the biggest housing bubble in Canadian history. And now that the central bank is forced to raise interest rates, it risks bursting that bubble. And all the people that got on the balloon when it was on the ground floor and it went up into the sky now risk coming crashing down as that balloon is bursting. And worse than that, the Bank of Canada now has hundreds of billions of dollars of deposits that it made into the accounts that it has on its reserves of those large financial institutions. Well, what's happened to those deposits? They now bear more interest because interest rates have gone up. So the wealthy bankers that participated in this arbitrage transaction at the beginning and were paid for it by having their more money deposited into their accounts at the Bank of Canada now collect 3.75%, because that is the policy rate that the bank pays. Now, what does that mean? That the central bank is now losing money for the first time in its history, and Canadian taxpayers are forced to bail them out to a tune of $4 billion every year. This entire wretched scheme, of which I warned 2 years ago, will maybe in the end amount to the single biggest wealth transfer from working class people to ultra wealthy insiders, from the have-nots to the have-yachts at any time in our history. Mr. Speaker, and now we see the painful consequences. It's not just about numbers on a ledger. It's about 1.5 million people forced to go to a food bank in a single month. It's about 1 in 5 people skipping meals or cutting portions because they can't afford their food. It's about the forthcoming winter, of which the minister spoke in metaphorical terms, who are now not going to be able to heat their homes, as the cost of home heating is expected to double or even more for those people who are on home heating oil. It is about the 35-year-old living in his parents' basement, despite the fact that he did everything we asked him to do. He got a job, he got an education, he worked hard at every day, and now he can't afford a home, which means he can't build up collateral, cannot build credit history, cannot build savings for his future, and therefore cannot start a family. In Canada, a country with among the most abundant supply of land on earth, we can't find places for people to live. These are the real-world consequences of irresponsible decisions. And meanwhile, the Prime Minister sits and smirks at the fact that he took a $6,000 a night vacation to sleep in the fanciest hotel on planet Earth, staying up in opulent hotel lobbies, jazzing it up with his friends, while people back home cannot pay the rent. Canadians are out of money, and this Prime Minister is out of touch. So, Mr. Speaker, the question is, we're going to inherit this mess, all of us.
Yeah.
We're going to have to fix the problem. We have a big job ahead of us, don't we?
Yeah, we
have
do.
a very big job ahead of us. He'll leave a big mess just like his dad left. He'll be off on a beach somewhere surfing, and the rest of us will be busy working in here cleaning up the mess he left behind. The sooner that happens, the better it is. His own hotels, right? Because we won't be paying for them anymore. He'll have to pay his own way, like Canadians are today. So how are we going to clean up this mess? Well, for one, we're going to bring in a pay-as-you-go law, so that every time we bring in a new dollar of spending, we'll find the savings to pay for it. You know who does that? Everybody in the real world. Everybody in the real world does that. C'est comme ça que les mères monoparentales paient leurs factures.
That's how single mothers pay the bills. When they want to take their children on vacation, they find savings, they make savings in order to pay for it. That's what small businesses do. When they want to spend more money on advertising, they find ways to save elsewhere in the business. That's normal. That's what people do. That is what people do in the real world.
Is the condition that faces every creature in the universe. If there's only so much to go around, every creature in the universe except for the Prime Minister just takes everyone else's money to pay for his own wants and desires. But we're going, in the real world, when people, if a family wants a new deck, well, they might pass up on their vacation, or they find a deal on both the vacation, and maybe they pick up some of used lumber at a local construction yard in order to save some money, right? So that they can do it all within the same budget. Imagine if instead of just piling on new spending all the time, the government actually had to find savings to pay for it. That would force the same real-world trade-offs.
Just going to interrupt the Honourable Leader of the Opposition. I thought everything was going very smoothly and very nicely. We're respecting each other. Let's keep that up. And we'll let the Honourable Leader of the Opposition continue.
Thank you very much. I'm not allowed to mention the presence or absence of the Prime Minister, but I will just say that some people bring happiness wherever they go and others bring happiness whenever they go. So we're going to cap government spending. We're going to get the Bank of Canada back to its core mandate. You know, for 25 years, the Bank of Canada had a very simple mandate: 2% inflation. Brought in by the Mulroney government, stick to 2%. Interest rates, money supply were all governed to that purpose, and it worked. It worked until this Prime Minister came along and pushed the bank to print cash to pay for his spending. We're going to have no more of that. We will fund our programs with real money rather than printed cash, because we know that there are no freebies in this world, and we know that ultimately the taxpayer and the consumer pay for everything. We will reinstate that mandate, and we will audit the central bank through the Auditor General to make sure that never again is there such a horrendous abuse of our money as we have seen over the last couple of years.
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.